Welcome to the program. I'm Jessica Van Vonderen. The Liberal National Party is desperately trying to present a united front after this week's extraordinary leadership coup. But some MPs are deeply concerned and outraged about the way Campbell Newman was installed as their leader in waiting. Chief among them, the deposed Deputy Leader, Lawrence Springborg. He says efforts by party officials to recruit Brisbane Lord Mayors are dangerous precedents that must never be repeated. I spoke with Mr Springborg at the end of a turbulent week. Lawrence Springborg, you must be terribly disappointed with this week's events.
There's no doubt that this week's events have been quite extraordinary, but I suppose that's Queensland politics. But for me, the real concerning thing has been the intrusion of unelected party officials into the due process of parliamentary democracy and the right of MPs to choose their own leader. And indeed what we've seen this week from unelected party officials has been a contravention of our own constitution and also a contravention of this document which Bruce McIver himself and John Paul Langbrook last year ticked off on, which made it very, very clear that it was the role of members of parliament to lead the way in honesty, integrity and openness, and making sure that at all times they respect Westminster Convention and restore people's trust and faith in the political process. I think we've seen that undermined this week. This is not about Campbell Newman and whether he has the obvious capabilities that he does have, and he has some extraordinary capabilities, and I've got no doubt that he can contribute very much, but that should not in any way overshadow what has been an extraordinary intrusion by unelected party officials into the responsibilities of elected members of parliament.
Is the executive trying to take over?
Well, the executive this week and obviously last week and probably in a month or two beforehand have overstepped the mark on what not only the members of parliament but also the public at large expects from those people in political organisations. Members of parliament are elected by the community. They have responsibility to take forward their views to the parliament. They can of course take advice from outside sources and bodies and individuals, but at no stage does parliamentary democracy mean that outside unelected officials should force somebody else on them as leaders, as a fait accompli, and expect that the parliamentary wing should accept that and indeed applaud it.
So if the executive is calling the shots, how does the public have confidence in the LNP if unelected people are running it?
Well, the LNP is a great organisation. Indeed, I'm very, very proud of the LNP. And indeed, at the last state election, we put ourselves in a very credible position by being open with the electorate, by actually listening to the electorate on the issue of unity and established ourselves as a credible alternative for the next state election. What we've seen this week undermines some of that confidence in the electorate because we've had unelected officials of the party overstretch their hand and get involved in things which are clearly not their constitutional responsibility and indeed undermine the President's own commitment in this document which he made when he signed it off with the Leader of the Opposition or the former Leader of the Opposition last year.
Given that, does the President have to resign?
Well, the President obviously takes his own counsel. All I would say to the President and the unelected parliamentary officials, these are unelected people in the context of Parliament, should go back to doing what they do, and that is supporting members of Parliament. They can of course provide advice, but it is not their role to foist an alternative Premier on the parliamentary wing. It is not their role, it is not their responsibility, it is against Westminster Convention, and it's a very, very dangerous precedent.
What's the mood in the party room then? Is the parliamentary wing at war with the executive here?
Well, the parliamentary wing has been dismayed about this particular process. There is probably now a degree of inevitability that it is going to happen because it has been foisted and it has been developed at such an extent that people don't want to be so much at war with the organisation. But that doesn't mean that members of Parliament aren't very concerned and indeed outraged by this intrusion into the process of parliamentary democracy and the lack of respect that unelected party officials have had on the parliamentary process. There is a lot of annoyance, there is a lot of concern about this process.
You've seen the opinion polls, though, this week and the huge surge in support for the government. Doesn't that show that John Paul Langbrook wasn't the right man to offer as alternative Premier and couldn't win the election?
Well, no, it doesn't, because what we've seen is a rallying around the flag with the Premier since her performance in the recent natural disasters. People were looking for leadership at that particular time, and indeed, if we had been in government, John Paul Langbroek would have been seeking the same advice, and his disaster response would have been exactly the same. The difference would have been, though, in the way that the LNP would have mitigated and planned for dealing with the natural disasters and indeed our response. And we've already seen the wheels start to fall off on the government's own response to these natural disasters, where the Premier's own disaster relief fund and the payments is turning into another Labor disaster. Most people out there understand and know that this is fundamentally a dishonest government that lied about selling public assets, that lied about bringing in a fuel tax, that lied about putting up registration increases, that lied about the costs for people of Queensland. That's where we would have been able to bring it back during the campaign.
So you think the polls would have turned around again and gone back in the LNP's
Well,
favour?
we've seen polls fluctuate, and we shouldn't be having poll panic. The cost of fuel, the cost of electricity, the cost of water, all of those disasters plus the dishonesty of privatisation were going to come back and hang around Anna Bligh's neck like a noose. There is no doubt about that. And we've got to be very careful that we don't give her a get-out-of-jail-free card. And I think the intrusion of the organisation in this process, regardless of the obvious attributes of Campbell Newman, has very much done that.
So has the LNP lost the election now?
No, it hasn't. I mean, the Premier has said that the election could be any time. It was supposed to be next year. Now she's saying maybe this year. Now she's saying she's getting on with the flood recovery. Who knows what the Premier will do? All we know from the Premier's past history with regards to the abolition of the fuel tax, or the introduction of the fuel tax, I should say, and also the sale of public assets without consent, that this Premier will do and say anything to win the election. We shouldn't be helping her. This is not helpful, what has happened this week. Campbell Newman has some obvious, enormous attributes. He is very dynamic, he is very energetic, he's a proven performer. That is not the issue. People should in no way take that and forget about this dreadful intrusion into parliamentary process and the independence of the parliament by unelected party officials.
Given your criticism of the executive wing, how can the public vote for the LNP?
Well, the public has these concerns, and I think the public also expects that members of parliament have those concerns and stand up to the organisation.
How do they do that? How do they stand up?
Well, I'm demonstrating it today that I'm uncomfortable with this, and a lot of members are uncomfortable with this, and I am saying to the organisation that you may have got away with it once, but don't ever think you can do it again.
Jeff Seeney says he assumes that both you and John Paul Langbroek are still carrying out your shadow portfolio responsibilities. Is that the case?
Well, earlier this week, when myself and John Paul Langbroek made the decision to step aside from our positions, we said clearly at that stage that we would not be continuing in the shadow ministry. And indeed, the seating plan, which had been prepared by the office of Mr Seeney, indicated that we're on the backbench. So I don't know where the confusion has arisen.
So who is doing your shadow portfolio responsibilities at the moment?
Well, what happens is if there are responsibilities and bills that need to be dealt with, the opposition leader, of course, has the supreme responsibility to deal with that himself or to delegate it to whomever he may wish. But it's clearly not me, because myself and Mr Langbroek did resign from our leadership positions and our shadow ministerial positions earlier this week.
Lawrence Springborg, thank you.
You're more than welcome.